The fact is that we just haven't built enough houses. It was a perennial problem for the Cameron administration. We scrapped the housing targets that the previous Labour government had imposed, and we then basically had to come back to them. The answer is always for local councils to say no. There are very few votes in building new houses because the voters aren't there. But actually, if you take a long-term view, you get more from council tax and so on and so forth. You get better infrastructure because the developers help pay for it. And as Latika says, we have a real housing crisis in this country. We have to address it.
Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves targeting the Green Belt for new homes. The Labour leader and prospective Chancellor have told the paper in their first joint interview that they plan to turbocharge house building from day one after the election. At least 3 housing announcements are expected within the first fortnight of a Labour government. They will involve a redrawn planning policy framework, reimposing housing targets and asking councils to review their Green Belt land. Latika, this is, for the first time, quite specific detail from Labour on what they plan to do. And it sounds pretty ambitious. I'm just wondering how feasible you think it is going to be in the context of NIMBYs and the world in which we live, where yes, some people want new homes, many people want new homes, but there are lots of people living in those areas who absolutely don't.
Yes, good morning. I think this is absolutely priority number one for whoever wins this election. And I would say this is the challenge for Western governments right across the world, because if we don't get more young people into housing that they can afford independently, I think we are going to raise a generation of anarchists, and you're already seeing that in votes. And I know we'll talk a bit later about this surge of far-right support in Europe. So I think the objective and the priority that Labor is giving this is absolutely bang on. I think it's great they've come out with this in the Sunday Times in particular, because I think this is going to be very controversial, and Sunday Times readers are the exact sorts that they need to convince and get over the line on this. But what really impresses me here is the level of detail. They've thought about the planning. They've got plans to recruit new planners. They're going to write to councils, which of course they will need to get on board for this. So it looks like they've spent a lot of time preparing this policy detail. To be honest, my only criticism is why have they waited until just a couple of days before the election to announce this policy and in this level of detail? I think this is something they could have been selling as their flagship policy 6 months out from election.
Ed, what do you think about this? Because clearly there are going to be people, young people who are living in cramped housing with maybe young families who are going to welcome this, even older people who want to basically kick their kids out of their own house. But there's going to be some people, some sectors of society this is going to be really unpopular with, and potentially those are the people who could put Keir Starmer in number 10.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the kind of policy actually that the Conservatives would want to capitalise on, which is probably the reason, to answer Latika's point, why Labour have waited so long to be so specific about their concerns. If I was still the candidate in Wantage, for example, which is in South Oxfordshire, which is close to London but still fairly rural, it'd be very easy to put out a leaflet saying Labour's planning to build all over our green and pleasant land. It would be a political tactic, and it wouldn't be fair, because I agree with Latika that this is the right policy. There's a report from a think tank that came out recently that made the point that if you built houses within half a mile of a commuter town, that houses that were still technically on greenbelt land, you could build 2 million homes next to transport hubs, great transport links, which would make a massive difference. The fact is that we just haven't built enough houses. It was a perennial problem for the Cameron administration. We scrapped the housing targets that the previous Labour government had imposed, and we then basically had to come back to them. The answer is always for local councils to say no. There are very few votes in building new houses because the voters aren't there. But actually, if you take a long-term view, you get more from council tax and so on and so forth. You get better infrastructure because the developers help pay for it. And as Latika says, we have a real housing crisis in this country. We have to address it.
But we also have to...
I also think,
Sorry,
Chloe,
Latika.
we also have a system where everybody widely acknowledges that everything is broken, that things are stuffed, that whatever the order has been is not working for any of us. So I think actually if Ed were that candidate running around with leaflets, yes, it might be a short-term tactic. But I really do wonder if voters' minds are shifting and they do see through short-termism in a way that maybe 5-10 years ago they weren't prepared to see through.
But I also wonder, Ed, if enough is being done. It certainly doesn't feel like it currently to force the developers to impose the infrastructure and bring it in. I mean, I've used an example before on this programme, I'll use it again. Where I live, there was a really ugly, disused piece of land, massive piece of land, which was developed for housing. Really, really sensible. Good couple hundred houses put on it, but it was right next to an outstanding primary and secondary school. And suddenly, there were no new schools built. Suddenly, everybody who was in the catchment area for this fantastic school, loads of people suddenly weren't in it because all those houses, understandably, were snapped up by young families who wanted to send their children to these outstanding schools. And people wouldn't have minded, because it was an ugly sight, if another school had been built. But it wasn't, and it really upset people in the local area.
Yeah, I think alongside answering the question about building more houses, which has to be answered, Labour to a certain extent have also addressed that issue in terms of talking about recruiting more planning officers, which sounds unbelievably dull, but is very, very important because you have to hold developers to account. And we have an oligopoly in this country. Just a few developers have the resources in which they can purchase land, which is hugely expensive in the southeast. They can hold on to it for as long as they want. They can have an army of lawyers to force their plans through councils who don't have the resources to push back. And you're quite right. I mean, certainly in Wantage, in my constituency, we did succeed in getting additional infrastructure, additional schools and so on. But you have to have tough planning officers with the skills and resources to hold developers to account, to build the roads, to build the schools, to build the GP surgeries that will be needed when you're growing your local population.
And do you think, Latika, it would be better to sort of tag on houses, for use of a better expression, on current villages and towns, or just be bold and say, right, we're just going to build a new town, we're going to do another Milton Keynes?
I think go for everything. I think there's a lot of ambitious scope. I've heard of plans where you can convince entire neighbourhoods to agree together whether they all want to add another level to their homes, thereby, expanding the amount of people that can live in a place, expanding their value. These things can go a long way. And I think Labor is right to come in if it does score a big majority and say, actually, we're the party that can force open a lot of these uncomfortable conversations. And of course, it's Labor voters too that will be perhaps needing some persuading about these sorts of policies as well, because I did, for example, a very, very long story a couple of years ago on a lend-lease development in Elephant and Castle in southeast London. And what they found there, it was a Labor-run council, and what they found there was that the opposition to gentrification and tearing down what were really, really appalling housing estates and replacing them with a mix of affordable and not so affordable housing was actually very controversial. And they came away and said, we'd never do this again. So there's a lot going on here. And I do think it's reassuring, just like with the NHS and what Wes Streeting has been saying, to see Labor taking some ownership of the need to also talk to their own voters about how to change attitudes on some of these thorny issues.
Lots of messages coming in on this. Di says, we're having new homes built in our village, but the school is only small. The main road is always blocked. How the heck is our village going to manage? No thought has gone into this problem. It will be gridlocked in a few months' time. Infrastructure has to be sorted before building houses. Our village will be at a standstill. And also there's concerns people also have about flooding as well. Someone else got in touch here, Paul, saying it's not so much the building of houses, it's the supporting infrastructure to support housing that needs addressing: roads, water, sewage, schools, etc., and indeed new towns.
And Mary gets in touch about affordable homes. She says, when is someone going to stop the revolving door and actually build smaller, lower cost, lower impact to the environment homes, affordable starter homes? And Mark says the people who live in newly built homes already exist. They're probably living with their parents. They already use doctors and schools. I suppose it's a matter of whether they move to a different area. I actually used to work as a special advisor in the housing department only for about a year and a half, and we knew then inside government we were not building enough homes. There was no doubt about that. I also once lost a major housing company £387 million by sending a text message, but that's another story. Let's talk about... Yeah.
Oh, my word.
Yeah.
Do you guys, can I just add one more thing? Do you guys remember during the Liz Truss Rishi Sunak leadership campaign, Sunak was like, wow, my grand policy is flat pack homes? Has he ever built one in the time he's been Prime Minister? Has one been built?
Must still be in the flat pack.
Or is that just me? Was that just a bad dream?
Must still be in the flat pack.